Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of Manchester Middle East Centre online webinar on Beyond the Black Swan, a follow-up session with Malcolm Smith. For those of you who aren't familiar with Malcolm Smith, he is an alumnus of the University of Manchester's Alliance Manchester Business School and has lectured on a number of programs over the last 6 years. His specialties are venture capital, private equity, selling strategy, and negotiation skills. He has a degree in applied physics and is a member of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. He spent 25 years in the food sector, and his role for the last 12 years in the industry was that of CEO of large international enterprises. Recently, he has become involved with the venture capital sector and has acted as a CEO, chairman, and most recently in non-executive directorship roles in the internet space. So thank you very much for being here, everyone. And thank you very much, Malcolm, for your presentation today as well. And I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. And I can only say that I've been looking at the names assiduously of these people who are attending, and I've got some friends who I've taught. So my friends from the Middle East are there, and I wish them well, and I'm glad they could find the time to join today in this rather interesting time in our history. I'm trying to talk, what this is all about is it's kind of a follow-on from what we discussed at the last time. I have to say I've spent a bit of time researching this anyway for my business interests as to what's going to happen next and how best to take advantage from the circumstances we find ourselves in and where the positives lie in a time of negatives. And of course, there's always positives. And contrarian investors are the ones who make the most money, and contrarian strategists tend to get the biggest bang for their buck at difficult times. So I'm going to talk about some rather interesting, I think it's rather interesting anyway, opportunities that are facing us and how we might best get the best outcomes. It's not just about negotiation theory, of course, it's about the areas where you might wish to look for value in this situation post the Black Swan. Of course, you might argue it's not post the Black Swan because who knows whether the Black Swan's going to come back to feed again. In my view, it definitely will, but it's a question how we manage that process. And of course, as time goes on, because we're such an innovative, inventive species, we will defeat this, we will move on. However, I think we've made some very interesting learnings, and I want to talk about those and about why we've made those learnings and what's created the pace of change. And there's been a huge increase in the pace of change, particularly in the digital sector where I work now. And I've been very excited to see the changes in the digital sector. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, both in terms of the region and in terms of the geopolitical issues in the region of the Middle East, and of course, the other issues which, of course, relate to the global position, which has been driven in terms of digital space by, of course, the US, which is the way it is. But nonetheless, there's a lot of stuff going on all around the world, which will have ramifications for all of us over the next 5 to 10 years. It's important to understand that when you get major changing points like this in history, the outcome isn't immediately obvious at the time, other than to a few gifted individuals who make some very smart guesses, and that's what they are, and they usually back them with a lot of money, and this is where billionaires are made. So at the moment, I want to talk to you about the things that have happened and how this webinar is focusing on the things we can do to improve our outcomes. So without further ado, this is all about modeling the new normal and how to ensure that it includes you and your company, because not everyone's going to succeed. The difference between winners and losers at a time like this is actually it's very simple, really. There's going to be a lot of losers, believe you me, and we're starting to see them now. And I'll talk about some sectors which are going to die, and there are some sectors which are going to die, and some that will grow from the ashes. It's almost like a phoenix moment. But understand one thing, what we're seeing now isn't going to change, it's going to accelerate. And the things that you're seeing affecting your business are definitely going to change. And I want to talk about how you might react to that. What's going to happen right now is that proactive companies will win. And of course, reactive companies at the best will get the crumbs from the table that the proactive companies take the major feast from. And this sounds a bit like a cliche, but it isn't. It's just one of those times in your life, and there aren't going to be many of them, I hope, well, as the Chinese say, beware of what you wish for, because it may happen. And another wonderful phrase from my friends in China is, we live in interesting times, and we certainly do. So information asymmetry is what this is all about. And at a time of change, the old maxims and the old paradigms die, and the way that we used to think about things is no longer relevant, and the answers we used to think always gave us the right outcome are no longer correct. Or to put it another way, it's if only I'd known that is the sort of thing you're going to hear a lot of in the next 6 months, because people are going to make the wrong calls, and they're going to think afterwards, if I'd only thought about that, if I'd only known that, then I could have got a much better outcome. And today is about how you can avoid saying that most horrible of all phrases, if only I'd known that. With new times, of course, come the new models, and from extraordinary events such as we've just seen, flow new ideas, and they shape the new normal. Now, this seminar and the thoughts I'm going to be presenting you with, and I'm very happy to have your comments. And of course, we'll take questions, and I'll answer them during the course of this seminar. If you've got any questions, just put on web chat, and William is very kindly going to host that. And if something's really immediately important, he'll interrupt me, and I'm very happy to do that and answer your questions. But I have broken it sort of 2/3 of the way through and at the end to answer your questions. I'm also going to be asking you questions for you to answer on the web chat during the course of this seminar. So this webinar is all about ensuring that the new normal includes you, but more importantly, not only that it includes you, but that you shape your part in it. It's not enough just to be on the horse. It's about pointing the horse in the direction which you perceive as being attractive to you. Now, negotiating new boundary conditions is very exciting, and negotiators always forever deal with ambiguity. I mean, all the time we're dealing with ambiguity and unknowns and uncertainties. And just at the moment, we're dealing with the outright unknown on a regular basis, because the kind of things we're seeing and the kind of reactions that we're getting to the normal kind of approach are not what you'd normally expect. And you've got to be really on the ball. So we're in such times now, and I've got to say this to you: don't imagine that we will return to what was. That's gone, but not everybody realizes it yet. And those people who don't realize that what was gone. Oh, William, can you knock off your microphone? I think you left it on. So, what role do negotiations play? Negotiations impact upon outcomes, especially when we're in uncharted waters, as we are now. Having the skills to deliver better outcomes achieves a very important objective. And of course, negotiations at times of change are even more relevant than they are normally, because at times of change, you've got to change a lot of boundary conditions, which means you have to impact upon the relationships that you have and also the contracts you have and are going to have with your supply chain partners. So if you've got the skills to deliver better outcomes in any situation, because these rules are empirical, it's going to deliver a very important objective. And the important objective which superior negotiation skills delivers is survival. Now, at a time like this, all companies can hope to do in the short term is to survive. Because at times of change, number one is like hierarchy of needs. When there are times of change, the first thing you got to do is keep a roof above your head, and that means survival. Then, of course, you've got to feed yourself, which means gets cash flow, and then you can't start looking forward. But if you don't survive, there's no point in looking forward. As one of my old bosses used to say, God bless him, Fred Duncan, used to always say to me, if your tail's on fire, don't look forward, put the fire out. And I've never forgotten that. Never quite understood what it meant, but it sounds great. So I'm going to ask you the first question. Beware, ladies and gentlemen, beware of the answer. There are 3 golden rules of negotiation. What do you think the first rule is? If any of you have got any ideas, now, please put it on web chat now. It'd be really a lot of fun if you did. And I've asked William to keep an eye on web chat. Please just put your answers on web chat, and he'll relay the first 4 or 5 answers that come out the back. So just tell me now what you think the first rule of negotiation is. And then I'll tell you what
Absolutely, Malcolm. So we'll just wait for the first couple of answers to come in, and I'll pass them on to you.
Thanks, William. Great. Come on, be brave now. Just get your fingers.
So we have we have never ever compromise by Salma. Do not compromise. That seems to be recurring a lot.
As anybody says, never ever compromise, brackets, ever, underline, exclamation mark, in brackets?
No, but very close.
Well, it's not 100. So people think it's never ever compromise or don't compromise. Is that what they're saying, basically, right?
Correct.
Okay. I'm now going to tell you what the first rule of negotiation is. Remember what I said. In times of change, things change. So rule number one now is don't work from an old set of rules. In other words, never ever compromise ever is an old set of rules. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's an old set of rules. So rule number one is don't work from an old set of rules in a new paradigm, because if you do, you're going to get burned big time. So anybody got any ideas on rule number two? Now, this is more interesting. Anybody got any ideas on rule number two? So put them on web chat again if you think you know the answer to this very illuminating question, and then we'll talk about that.
So we have remember rule number one and don't follow any rule.
Well, there's obviously an anarchist in the audience who doesn't follow any rules. Anarchy and business don't go too well together, I'm afraid. Whoever said that, I admire their amusing approach, but no, that's of course refer to rule number one, because it's so important to remember you can't work to an old set of rules. I'm going to repeat it twice. Whoever said that's obviously a very bright person. So well done them, full marks. You've got a chance of succeeding and you've got a chance of surviving if you answered it like that. So I'm going to finally ask, what do people think in this new world is rule number three? So I'll give you a minute or two to put your thoughts on rule number three, and then I'll talk about that.
So we have define your own rule. We have there is no rule number three. We have realize the new normal.
Okay, they're on the right track. Let me tell you what my redefined rule number three is, because it's quite significant. Look at the deal from the point of view of your counterparty and find a way to create value for both. At a time like this, when everyone's coming out of what has been pretty much a disastrous time for business, I mean, let's be honest, in the West, the economies are devastated by the virus. I mean, it was a decision we took. It wasn't as if it was a storm that came out of nowhere. The governments took a decision to try and save their people, which is the first and most important rule for any government. And they necessarily decimated the economies of the world. And certainly for at least 1 month, the economies in the Western world, at least, took a 30% dip. As to what happened in China, it's rather difficult to know, because as we know that the official statistics are a little bit more suspect than the ones in the West, and even the ones in the West aren't particularly 100% correct. But what has happened in the West is about a 25 to 30% drop in GDP for about a 6-week period. Now, in a situation like that, when you're emerging from a total disaster, from a position which is unprecedented certainly in our lives, you've got to think about things carefully from the perspective of both counterparties, really. It's no good trying to go and snatch all the value from the table. That's not going to work, because the other guy's going to fail, and then you're left with no supply chain partner. You've got to work in a problem-solving way to find a way to create value for both in a time of disastrous consequences for everyone in the supply chain. One of the biggest problems at the moment is filling up the supply chain, by the way, as some of you may know. So let's move on. Now, negotiations are, at their very best, are rational all the time. And great negotiators only have the one aim, which is to diminish information asymmetry, and that's a big issue right now. with the intention of identifying, our put brackets, new ways to create value, because there are new opportunities facing us now which were never there before, which maybe they were there but we didn't see them. I'll come back to that. At times like this, which is unprecedented, and old models are no longer even relevant, don't try and adjust them, they're no longer relevant. It's important to look at the business from an empirical point of view and look at the key factors which can impact upon your future sustainability as an entity. Forget about the past, forget about the mess you're in now, because money's terrible. We're all burning money as if it was like bonfire night. But the reality is we've got to accept the fact that's gone. And businesses that think about, okay, that's gone now, where are we going to go? Look about future sustainability as a key factor in their thought process going forward. They don't try and reinvent history, because that's a bit of a stupid thing to do. Stalin tried it and look what happened to him. So let's talk about the future sustainability. What factors impact upon your future sustainability? But once again, let me just reiterate this. Before you think about future sustainability and how to negotiate a new deal, remember the rules have changed. Partners or options are hugely altered, because what was a possible option before no longer is, because it's gone. And interests, people's interests have changed. I mean, people's interests today are quite frankly focused all around survival and getting back off the ground again. That's what it's all about. So where do we start when we start looking at our counterparties in the supply chain? Let's think about studying the new partners. And I'm going to repeat a message I gave at the first webinar, which is about being kind in difficult times. Remember those companies which helped you out. For example, for my own businesses, and I'm blessed to be a chairman of a lovely business in the Middle East, there were companies that helped us out very significantly and came to our aid, and we were very honest with them, and they were honest with us, because they were also in trouble. And they came to our aid at that time, and we worked our way through it very successfully together. And those companies, we're going to focus on them. We're going to do more business with them from now on and forever, because they are part of the solution. They did not try and be part of the problem. They've built an unbreakable bond with us, a bond of loyalty, which was forged in fire. I know, because I'm a turnaround specialist. And when you come out of a turnaround, the people that were involved in that turnaround are people you'll never forget, because it's a cathartic moment. So in the dealings with the people who helped you out, adopt a different approach, because they're part of the solution. And as for those companies which are downright difficult, and there were a few of those, all bets are off in the new normal. They're up for grabs. And as far as I'm concerned, every negotiation with them is I want and you can take. You can take what I want to give you. That's it. And this forms the basis of your negotiation strategy. Your strategic approach with the two different kinds of supplier or client, to be honest, are in fact totally different, because you've got to look forward to those that helped you. So the virus has had one major impact upon us as a business environment or an ecosystem, and it's really interesting. It's accelerated changes which were already happening. There were latent changes in the system which were kind of bubbling underneath the surface, and we all knew about, but we didn't really want to do. Now, this virus impact has done one thing. It's changed our lives in one very important moment, because the pace of change accelerated in those trends which were already apparent, and old mindsets are fundamentally altered. Why is that? Well, let's be frank about this. When you're up against the wall and your future is totally at stake, and basically all bets are off, you don't know what's going to happen, you'll take chances you would never normally have taken. You'll do things that you wouldn't normally do, because there's nothing to be lost from trying it. When the house is on fire, you'll do anything you can to put it out. For example, in the digital businesses I've been involved in, we've had a very successful time by working with our clients and saying, okay, we'll give you a couple of months at either half price or nothing, depending on the circumstances. Then we'll come out of it together and we'll talk about what happens afterwards. And that has avoided what we call churn in that industry. And those clients have come back to us and in general have been absolutely first class in terms of saying, okay, really, thanks so much for helping us. Now let's talk about the future. And one of my other companies, we've actually offered free trials for the first time ever. with tremendous effects. And in fact, it's now forming a part of our future. Has been so successful that we've actually redesigned our business around that, and it's changed our course of direction in a way which will not go back to what it was. So don't get behind the curve of change or you won't survive. Don't go back to what was. It ain't there no more. So let's look at the key variables. Now, some of these you'll recognize very well. Of course, landlords are a key issue, and we're all having a lot of fun with our landlords now. The workforce, that's changed significantly. I'll talk about that. Clients and prospects, they've got a different view after all of this. Sometimes better, sometimes worse, interestingly. Supply chain partners per se have got a very different view of the future because they've been through the same kind of cathartic event that you have. And of course, lenders. The relationship with lenders is fundamentally going to alter over time as well. And I'll talk about that. So landlord. Was really poor, even poorer than it is now. The links to the web weren't as well developed as they are. Yes.
Apologies. The sound just cut for a little moment there from your end, I believe, so people didn't really hear in regards to this slide. If you don't mind just going through that again.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, William. I really appreciate that. Thanks. That's great. So the most significant change is home working. For 20 years, we've been talking about home working, and we never did it, partly because Wi-Fi wasn't as good as it even is now, which isn't very great. It depends on where you are. And also, the web wasn't as well connected as it is today. And of course, 5G is now starting to appear in some parts of the world, and 4G is pretty well entrenched. So, of course, it's now possible to do home working. My son, in fact, lives and works in San Francisco. Believe it or not, the infrastructure for Wi-Fi in California is appalling. It's even worse than it is in some parts of the UK, which amuses me intensely. And he's finding working on Zoom 8 hours a day to be rather wearing. I'm sure some of you are finding virtual meetings a bit of a difficult one because, first of all, you sometimes find the recipient has got poor Wi-Fi, just like I obviously just had then, which is annoying, or you can't actually get impact upon the relationship. You can't sort of relate to them very well. But we're all going to have to get used to virtual working, and home working is here to stay. Now, all around the world, there is a Landlord and Tenant Act of one kind or another, and they're all out of date because they've all been basically written for the landlords and, of course, their lenders. So what has happened is the banks and landlords have had a very, very cosy arrangement whereby the landlords have long-term leases with upwards only revisions. The banks therefore lend the money on the basis of this, and they have a lovely little arrangement which closes out everybody that isn't in that nice little tight bubble. Well, guys, that's gone. Tenancy agreements are going to become much more flexible around the world, some places quicker than others, but it's going to happen. And it's going to become more short-term. And you need to build this into your thinking. Landlords will attempt to prevent the change and say, oh, no, it's back to normal now, guys. You know that money you didn't pay, I want it now. I want it all now, as if it's going to appear like magic. What a joke. Landlords will try and prevent change, but so did Canute. King Canute is a figure from UK history, tried to stop the tide coming in. Didn't have much luck with that, and landlords won't have much luck with it either. You need to change the relationship with your landlords, it's a contractual relationship, and you've got to be upfront with them and saying, look, guys, forget about the past. Leasing agreements, of course, will vary depending on the sector. One area which is really sexy right now is distribution centers, because, of course, the huge growth in online sales around the world is truly astonishing. But the average situation that we're seeing around the world today, those people who are involved with online have seen 5 years worth of growth in 7 weeks. 5 years worth of predicted growth in 7 weeks. One of the largest retailers in the US, for example, has just increased their online sales from about 5% to about 15%. And the difference is equal to twice the annual turnover of Tesco's, which is the largest retailer in the UK. I mean, these are astonishing numbers we've just never seen before. So it's dramatic change from basically offline to online. And we're going to see, therefore, people who are working in bricks and mortar are going to have a different relationship with the landlords, because they're not going to get the footfall, because people aren't going to go back. And we're going to see turnover-based rentals. For example, especially in the fast food industry, change in the West, whereby the people in the fast food business with lots of different outlets are saying immediately to the landlords, right, forget about the past. You've got to start talking to us now about turnover-based rentals. So the more we turn over, fair play, the more you get. But if turnover isn't increasing, you get less. After all, what is the landlord's partner? Who's going to take over the property? You might say, oh, somebody else will come in. Like who? So things have changed. They have to understand that. And you, in your relationship with them, without being adversarial, have got to be quite assertive and say, guys, things have moved on. So let's just move on with it. Now, in the new normal, the workforce is rather interesting as well. Working from home doesn't mean reduced productivity at all. In fact, in my businesses, we've seen increased productivity, especially in developers and back office. It really hasn't affected anything at all. It's just all it's done actually is reduced everybody's costs. They don't have to come to work. We don't have to have an office environment for them. And we're all thinking very carefully about that. In future, those of you who can should look to agree a structure for home working and put in place automated KPIs, key performance indicators, to measure their output. But agree the metrics, don't make them ridiculous, don't impose them as it should be counterproductive. Look, just agree what's likely to be the outcome and then measure it. And they see the measure, you see the measure, everybody's happy. But also look at ways to improve their experience. If necessary, pay for an increase in their bandwidth, because it's in your interest to do so, and they'll be much quicker in terms of their connection with yourselves, and also be a lot easier to communicate if you don't have this situation where the Wi-Fi is always going in and out and in and out, and you can see the screen going different colors, all that kind of nonsense we've all seen over the last 6 weeks. I mean, I live in the boondocks. I live in the middle of nowhere, in the Cumbria in England. It's one of the most beautiful parts of the world. That's my opinion anyway. But we do not have the best Wi-Fi in the world. At best, I've got 1.5 megabits a second, which is nothing compared to what they have in Korea, for example, is gigabyte up and down, and that's not unusual in South Korea. Gigabyte up and down, probably one of the most advanced economies in the world from Wi-Fi, and that's what we're fighting. We're fighting people who are ahead of the curve. They've got fiber optic everywhere, and they can actually beat us in terms of the connectivity and the speed of connectivity, and that's going to be an issue for everyone. Workforce packages, this is going to be a bit emotive. The truth of the matter is that the workforce have got a much better work-life balance now, especially when the kids go back to school. At the moment, it's a real headache. If the schools are closed, working at home with children around you is a bit of a problem, and I recognize that. But very interesting, I was having a Zoom conference last week, and of course in Zoom you can put what you like behind yourself. Some people put an AMBS thing behind them if they really want to, or whatever. Some people are real sadists, and they put a vision of a beautiful beach behind them. But in fact, I was in the middle of a conference with somebody, and then all of a sudden this child appears in front of the whiteboard and starts talking to the mummy, And I thought it was quite touching, actually. But this is a problem at the moment. However, when the schools start again, we're going to have much better work-life balance. People don't have to travel to work. The savings can be immense both ways. But look, the way to frame it to your workforce is, look, I'm going to leave you with the same package, which effectively is an increase for you. But understand one thing. I'm expecting the same amount of work at least. And if it falls off, we're going to have to talk about it. Our supply chain. This is a key issue for all of us, and I'm having lots of supply chain discussions right now. In fact, I've just received an email from one of my friends in the Far East. We're busy negotiating with a supplier, and they've come back with some very interesting ideas, which we kind of like. Remember that your suppliers are equally trying to come to terms with the new situation, the new reality. And it is important to empathize with their concerns, especially if they've helped you out. And you've got to communicate your own in such a way as not to preclude theirs. You've got to negotiate on the understanding you understand their concerns and you mitigate them. I'll give you an example. This is the guy who's responded to us, actually. I recently wrote to a supply chain provider, to one of my companies. I started with the following, and it was all about not being able to pay on terms. I started with email with, "This will not be welcome, but cannot come as a surprise in these unprecedented conditions." And this is about framing. What was I doing? Well, it's not what you say, it's the way that you say it. You've got to understand that people have got to be treated as human beings. You can be kind and yet still be assertive. The previous example sort of validate our inability to pay and to restructure the payment schedule by saying this will not be a surprise. And of course it wasn't, and they admitted that. And I was also upfront about the fact that they wouldn't like it very much, which was great because it made them recognize I was thinking about it from their point of view as well. And the response we got was very positive because we tried to be realistic and also we tried to understand their point of view. And the outcome for both of us was very good. This is a key issue at the moment, and I urge you all to think about this. If you're in negotiations, be careful you don't close a deal too far out. Supply chain partners are looking for long-term deals now more than they ever were. They're trying to get that extra 6 months or that extra 1 year on the deal. Don't do that. It's really not a good idea. Once you've discovered how far you can push the boundaries of the relationship and the deal, and gain general agreement on restructuring debt or on payment terms generally, or some kind of terms and conditions change, don't wait for the counterparty to define what they want and send you an email with their version of what they want to do. Take responsibility and email them to outline your new agreed terms, which of course will meet your requirements rather than allowing them to skew the debate by proposing their own. Don't let your financial director agree in principle, I love this word, in principle, a deal with the bank. And the bank writes back to you, and all of a sudden you think, that's not what I said. Because that's what you're going to get. Because it won't be the person you are talking to who writes the agreement, it'll be the lawyer. And the lawyer is only interested in one thing, of course, all around the world, which is their own health, well-being. And they don't think about commercial issues very often. And what they try and do is screw the deal in their direction. And that causes all sorts of problems. Take responsibility in the supply chain and email them with your version of what you've agreed. Don't make it a lie, but be very clear about that's what you've agreed. Summarizing at the moment is more important than it ever was because people will try and slip something in. You've got to watch for that. Please watch for that very carefully. I'm busy signing a really big deal at the moment in the UK. It's actually a recycling deal in the recycling sector. And the counterparty keeps saying yes, yes, yes. And the email comes back and we think, whoa, hang on a minute. When did yes, yes, yes become no, no, no? And finally, we've got on the front foot and we've sent our version of the contract and dared them to change it. We will see. Certainly, we're in a much better position than we were. So what I'm giving you here is from my own experience. Now, lenders. You've all got lenders of one kind or another. Working capital has been an issue at the moment. In fact, it's negative for everyone, I'd imagine, if there isn't at work. I mean, even the retailers, the online retailers have had problems because their supply chains couldn't cope with demand. So dealings with lenders promises to be a fertile field for change. I've used that phrase. It's a rather interesting phrase. In other words, it's going to be a right carb up as we approach negative interest rates. Last month, last month, it's only 3 days ago, the UK government launched a very big new gilt-edged auction. And the end result of that was we floated about £5 billion at negative interest rates. In other words, people are going to get back less money than they've paid, which is a very interesting analysis of people's perception of risk. So at times of what will become around the world effectively negative interest rates, everyone's interest rates will alter somewhat at this point in time. Things move on. And everywhere in the world, lenders will be under huge governmental pressure to support companies to return to work because governments are really concerned about major unemployment. They don't like that because that creates all sorts of difficulties in the economy and people get very upset if they haven't got a job and they don't vote them back in again. So governments are really keen that lenders support their clients at difficult times. The only thing is this, To be fair, you can't expect a lender or the government to give you support if there's no chance of survival at all. It's obvious you're a dead duck, you're going to die anyway. So don't make the assumption at this difficult time right now as you're going back to work with no money. Don't make the assumption you can continue without a clearly communicated plan. This is critically important with lenders. You've got to be upfront. Now, I always use the phrase with lenders, the truth sets you free. And it really does. The key to success in these negotiations with your lenders at these difficult times is to diminish information asymmetry for them. Tell them like it is. Provide them with an updated forecast, both P&L account and cash flow, and discuss your needs with them. But don't make it some wonderful like hockey stick shape where all of a sudden things get great again. We know they won't. So anybody who puts that into a bank or their lender is going to be perceived by the lender as a complete idiot. And of course, they're right. One thing that is in your favor is that the bank's partner has changed. Now, this is more in the West than the East, because in the West, we've had some terrible scandals with some very well-known banks. Royal Bank of Scotland in the UK have done some dreadful things. And they're on the back foot with the regulators. But around the world, banks will be under political pressure to support businesses with half a chance of success. It doesn't have to be a wonderful, roaring success, but you've got to have a chance of getting out of this. I'm going to, however, say this. In the case of truth sets you free, ask yourself one question at this moment in time and be honest in your answer. I want you all to ask yourselves this question about your business that either you own or you work for. And this is a critical question you should all be asking right now. Am I going to make it? Is my company going to make it? Are we going to be there at the end? It's really important to sit back. Don't just assume the ship's going to keep going, because it isn't. A lot of names are going to disappear over the next 12 months, if not immediately maybe, but a lot of companies are going to die by degrees, death by 1,000 cuts. If you don't think you're going to make it or your company's not going to make it, call it a day before you burn all your equity. So if you're a business that you own or you're a partner in is really going to hit the rocks, get your partners together and say, guys, we ain't going to make it, are we? Now, we might as well call it a day, talk to our lenders and just burn it. It's the best thing to do, because everybody, look, first, there's a very, very famous rule of business. First loss is best loss. Don't keep throwing good money after bad. Not everyone is going to survive in a new environment. And the people who know they aren't going to survive, no point hanging on, get out. Now, I'm going to take a little break now for questions. I'm about 2/3 of the way through my piece. I've got one or two interesting questions to ask you now, but I'm going to let you ask me questions first. William, if you can aggregate any questions that they've got so far, and I'll answer 2 or 3 or 4 questions now, and then we'll go on to the end. Is that okay, William?
Yeah, absolutely, with pleasure. So to start off, Malcolm, we have this question from, just need to find it again. Apologies. Yes. So this is from Val McKee. So is it not the case that capitalism and the focus on GDP, is now an old model and irrelevant model as well?
Well, capitalism is absolutely a shocking model, but it's better than anything else. So, you know, if somebody's got a better idea, I'd love to hear it. I can honestly say I've been around a long time, and people have been saying, I remember in the Cold War, when the socialist governments, who of course crashed and burned because socialism does not work, no one has ever made socialism work anywhere in the world. Just ask yourself how many people died of starvation in North Korea? How many people were killed by the Stalinist government in Russia? How did Cuba exist for so long? Because it took money from Russia. Look, I'm sorry, socialism does not work. I'm just a business person, and I can tell you now that when you take away the profit motive, people don't get out of bed in the morning. If people think that they can make a good life for themselves and their family, they'll get out of bed and they'll work when it's cold, when it's wet, when it's raining, even when it's lovely and hot. They'll work. If there's no future, then there's no point in working hard. Sorry. And that's the message of history. However, you've asked a very smart question in truth. I think we'll see capitalism be attenuated I think we'll see hopefully some of its more horrible aspects, and there are some dreadful aspects of capitalism. For example, the greed of the people with money. For example, CEOs, extraordinarily greedy individuals. Most of them aren't very good at what they do, and they get paid huge amounts of money. And that's one of the things that's going to change. I think that hopefully we're going to see a change in the way that private equity is taxed, because they've been pumping debt into businesses, making loads of money for themselves and walking away with other people's money. Now, I'm nothing against people wanting to make a few bob, because I want to do the same. But let's face facts, you've got to do it fair. You know, there's no point in stealing off people. That's not going to be very helpful, is it? So you've asked a smart question, but I'll tell you this: capitalism isn't dead. However, it may be about to suffer a small transformation, and if it does, all the better in my view, because I hate the greed of underperforming CEOs who pay themselves bonuses for using shareholders' money to buy back shares, so they get more of a bonus because the earnings per share is artificially increased. And that's one of the changes that I think will change, because companies have been running with thin balance sheets because they've been burning cash to pay dividends or to buy back shares for reasons which aren't related to the business purpose. So yes, I think capitalism will be attenuated.
That's perfect, and I think Marco very clearly mentions that. It's a very good follow-up to this question, saying maybe the more appropriate question would be, isn't this the end of turbo capitalism?
Well, turbo capital, there's a phrase now. Capitalism is by definition fairly fast moving, and what we're seeing as a response to the coronavirus is it's even got quicker. Things that were there at the back of our minds, online purchasing. Look, people who would never have dreamt of buying online have just switched to it, because number one, they had no choice, and number two, they've suddenly thought, hey, this is better. Why didn't I do this before? It's a bit like after the Second World War. After the Second World War, the position of women in the West changed dramatically, because they'd kept the factories going during the war. And when the husbands came home, they said to the husbands, look, we've had money for the first time in our lives. We kind of like that. Subsequent to that, and it took years, of course, things take years to happen. It isn't overnight. In the West now, and increasingly in the East, both parents work because they want to for a start off. And of course, it's a great way of improving your quality of life. And women want to be a participant in the system as well as men, and they've every right to. So those kind of things came about because of essential changes that had to happen in the Second World War. And in the same way, what we've seen here, to answer your question, is I think we're going to see capitalism changing in a different kind of way. At its very best, capitalism responds to the needs of the consumer, because capitalism is all about supplying needs. It's not an end in itself. If capitalism doesn't supply a definite need, perceived, real or otherwise, then it doesn't exist, because you ain't going to buy something you don't need. Now, you might say, we don't need a Hermes bag, and I wouldn't disagree with that. However, the people who like Hermes bags and Louboutin shoes and Rolls Royces, they've got every right to buy them if they wish, and it's a minority market, and that's okay by me. I have no interest in those things, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. So capitalism is really good at supplying needs and also then promoting those needs. But if there weren't needs in the first place, they wouldn't be getting served. So capitalism has this amazing habit of morphing, and I think it's going to morph now, and I hope that answers the questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Malcolm. I think one more question, which would be very, very interesting from Mohammed, is what are the chances of GCC currencies depegging with the USD? And in case of depegging, do you anticipate the US dollar to get stronger or weaker?
Well, this is a question that's been asked all over the world, and it's a really smart question, so thank you for asking it. I was listening to an interesting webinar just about a week ago from some wonderful alumni of Goldman Sachs, which I don't like very much. And they were talking about the way the world's going, and they were predicting the usual old hackneyed excuses. Oh yeah, we're all going to buy gold because that's a great hedge in difficult times. Gold's going to go up in price, you know, blah, blah, blah. Looking at the old solutions to the old paradigm. The reality is the dollar always has done in the last 60 years. Don't forget, it's only that, I think it's 70 years really. Since 1948, really, which was the Bretton Woods Agreement, after the Second World War, to grow trade, and let's be reason, the reason why the pound or the dollar became the new gold standard, because effectively the dollar is the gold standard now. The reason why it became the gold standard, if you like, was because of the Second World War again. After the Second World War, everybody with a brain, and there are a lot of people with brains knocking about. They're not all in the US, but some of them are. They got everybody called into Bretton Woods, which is why it's called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And all of the major participating economies in the world. And they said, look, we want to grow trade because we don't want to have another war. And of course, the Marshall Aid Plan was then dispersing monies to those people who'd suffered in the war. The losers, of course, got the most Marshall Aid, which was a paradox. And then they got together and said, right, to stop another war, we better start trading, because this isn't going to work, is it? Because why would all of our young people want to get killed? So we thought, right, there's only one way we're going to have to trade. Only way it's going to work is if we have a standard against which we can measure success, or some common standard in the world, so that people know if they want to get their money, they can go there and get it. So as at that point in time, the Bretton Woods Agreement, 1948, effectively everybody fixed their currencies against the dollar, and the dollar became the bedrock of international currencies, which it remains to this day, in order that people had some kind of assurance that there's some value somewhere which is absolute, and that was the dollar. And this continues today. And the dollar, of course, the Goldman Sachs geniuses, and I'm saying that in a loose term, think, oh, the dollar's going to increase to the point where all of a sudden nothing else matters. Well, we'll see about that. I think the Eastern economies have taken over enough of the GDP of the world that they'll have a part to play in the future definition of what the bedrock currency in the world will be. But I don't think it's not going to be the dollar for quite some time. And I think anybody who deep pegs against the dollar at this moment in time might not find that to be very productive, unless they're at an artificial rate, in which case that's not clever either. I mean, the UK is a truly floating currency, but of course, the pound is one of the reserve currencies of the world, so it can afford to do that. A currency which isn't a reserve currency, it's a bit cold out there. I mean, you can float your currency, and that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, but you've got to be very careful before you do that and think your way through it. Now, I know that's a rather hyperbolic answer to your question, but there isn't one obvious answer to that question. And as to the GCC, remember one thing, that the Middle East generally, I'm talking about the Middle East generally, is basically a petrocurrency. It's fundamentally based upon the price of oil. And of course, the price of oil is fundamentally in dollars. So it's a bit difficult to decouple yourself from the dollar if the way you earn your foreign currency is in fact in dollars. It's a bit meaningless. I hope that answers the question.
Perfect. Thank you, Malcolm. Would you like to take one more? Shall we carry on?
One more, then we'll carry on, yes.
Perfect, brilliant. So we have Brian here asking, well, he's stating first and foremost that survival is the name of the game in the short term, as you mentioned. However, to survive in the new normal, firms will need to innovate. So how can I convince senior management to invest in innovation at this time?
Well, first of all, if that's the Brian who asked me recently if my pension assets were safe, number one, yes, they are. And number two, don't be so cheeky. I'm not that old. I think it might be the Brian in question. So the simple fact is, if you have to convince your bosses that innovation is one of the ways forward, then you got the wrong bosses. Now, that might sound a bit trite, but anybody who hasn't figured out yet that innovation is in fact the way forward here and will be the way to create value and keep ahead of the pack really ain't very good bosses. And if all the bosses are like that, you better find a new boss or a new company, because they ain't going to do very well. In terms of how to persuasion is an important phrase. Let's use the word frame. It's a question of how you frame things. Now, at this particular point in time, there isn't a boss in the world who isn't thinking about his own survival as well as the company's. If you frame your proposals on the basis that, look, hey, I think this could fundamentally alter the future path of the company in a very positive way, and this is why, at least they'll listen to you. And you have to then have a persuasive argument. And I would use an approach called the investment hypothesis. And Brian, I think you might even remember that. I managed to drum that into your brain. And the fact is, if you adopt an approach which is process-driven, then you'll succeed. Anyway, I think we'll just carry on at this point, and then we'll go on to the end of the next final questions.
Thanks, Malcolm. And Brian is saying that it is the very same. It is the very same.
Thank you very much, Brian. So here we go. Negotiation skills. This is a very small, short section addressing the techniques you'll need in order to gain the best outcome. So I'm not going to bore you with the old stuff again. I'm going to ask you 1 or 2 questions again, and with 1 or 2 answers at the end. And it's not very long. So this is the key one. Preparation is the key, the name of the game. It just got a whole lot more difficult because our mind tends to think back to what used to work, and that no longer applies. Worker expectations have changed, especially those who work from home. Client expectations have changed. And they're saying, well, why do we have to spend hours traveling to a meeting when we can do most things on Zoom? And also, they're looking very much more carefully at the net for alternatives, even B2B. B2B is the biggest market in the world. B2C has been a big growth market. For example, Amazon is a classic case in point, of course, Alibaba in the East. But the fact of the matter is that people are using online purposes for finding new products and new prices in B2B as much as B2C now. And I think we'll see B2B digital grow dramatically. And that's one of the things you need to be very careful of when you're thinking about the future. Consumer expectations have made a step change in digital solutions, and they won't be going back. Don't think things are going to go back to the old normal. So preparation demands your mind to be fluid to the new normal. Don't use old methods. That's why I say rule number 1 is don't use old methods. Look at trendsetters. In the US, for example, the leading digital companies, for example, Jack Dorsey, who's currently having a lot of fun with President Trump over 1 or 2 things he's trying to do to Trump's normal rants on Twitter. Jack Dorsey said he doesn't expect anybody to go back to their work when we come back to the new normal, and they'll be working from home. And a lot of people have realized that why do you want to live in San Francisco? So the price of property in San Francisco will not be on its upward trajectory in the future. It will flutter, and that's for sure. If you want to hire great people in the future, you need to know where they want to live and work, and so that you can manage them in the new normal. You need to think about that very carefully. Of course, changes in perception affect BATNA, and that means that's the alternative to doing a deal. So new BATNAs mean if you think carefully about what you don't imagine the same old BATNAs apply in every negotiation. No, they don't. And it's really important to review your negotiation strategy for things you're going to learn at a time like this. So if you have a failure, review it carefully because you learn more from failures than success. Don't get tied into long-term deals which may cripple your company. Of course, one of the key issues at the moment is nobody wants to sign a long-term deal, especially in digital world. For example, on software solutions, not a great idea to sign a long-term deal right now because software solutions are going to change dramatically. And if your clients are saying, I don't want to sign a long-term deal, okay, build a model which accommodates it. If you don't, someone else will. Don't imagine the annual contract is going to carry on forever. Now, this is coming up to the end now. I'm going to ask you some of the old questions. I'm not going to answer them on web chat because some of you know the answers to these, but I've got an interesting little twist on the last one. There are 3 big lies you're going to hear in any negotiation. I've heard them all again in the last week as people are going back to work, and people are going back to work all over the world. And when you start negotiating, this is the one I hear most of all. To be very honest. I used to say to be honest, but now it's not good enough to say to be honest. You've got to say to be very honest. And especially when you get people talking about how things are going to be in the future, and they say, well, look, I can't pay you. To be very honest, I can't pay you because my clients haven't been paying me. Well, I've heard that enough times. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it isn't. But people are trying to validate a lie with the phrase to be very honest. Now, number 2 is, of course, trust me, as some of you'll know, and that's coming out again. Trust me, this is the best deal I'm going to offer you. Trust me, you're not going to get this from anyone else. Trust me, the extra 6 months makes a lot more sense. No, it doesn't. And number 3, of course, is the all-time favorite. I just heard this one. This came out last week. I'll tell you about it. It's company policy. I got recently this wonderful supply chain partner who said it's company policy that we have an agreement by the end of this week with regard to payment schedules for the next 6 months. I said, well, how does your company policy deal with coronavirus then? Have you got a policy on that? So can I see your pandemics policy? We haven't got one. I say, well, forget about what used to work then. So don't give me all this eyewash about company policy, because it's not true. So whenever I hear anybody say now it's company policy, I've got one simple response. And my response is, liar, liar, pants on fire. Because there ain't no company policy that deals with a new paradigm. New company policies are changing on terms of working capital, in terms of the consignment totals, in terms of all sorts of things. Supply chain relationships have completely changed. If anybody quotes old company policy, liar, liar, pants on fire, doesn't apply, because this is a changed circumstance. Things do not work the way they used to do. So let's move on from that nonsense about company policy, which does no longer apply, because things have changed. When things change, things change. So that's my answer to that. Look, thank you very much for listening to the end. Those of you who have, most of you have, and I really appreciate that. I'm happy to answer any further questions. I appreciate the fact you've taken the time to listen to this. I hope you found some of the things worthwhile. Not everything will affect you, some things will. William, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Malcolm. So we've just got a question here. There is potential for disagreement in the new normal. How do you get a party back to the negotiating table and avoid dispute or litigation?
Well, of course, there are going to be lots of situations where there are disagreements, especially when you've got two quite different points of view. What I would say to you is start out with the presumption that things have changed and the counterparty knows that as well as you do. And say, look, we can sit here and have an argument as long as you like, and you can tell me the contract says X, Y, and Z, and I better comply with it, otherwise there's going to be litigation. All I would say to you is this: who wins in litigation? Lawyers. Now, is that advantageous to you or me? No, it isn't. Let's try and form a solution which is good for both of us. And let's understand at the outset, neither of us is going to like totally what we agree, but it's better than the alternative, which is to beat our brains out with a load of lawyers who are just going to find more and more reasons to elongate the process to their own advantage and to the disadvantage of both of you and I. Business is not about litigation in this current circumstance, which demands fleet of foot. Being involved in litigation takes our eye off the ball, both of us. And that's my answer to that. And it's true. It's the way it is.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Malcolm. We have another one here. Interruptions in supply chains need more investment for continuity of supply. How do we balance this in the context of cash flow challenges due to drop in revenues?
This is a really good point, because I'm suffering from these challenges right now in the UK. I'm trying to buy a load of windows for one of my companies, and the supplier can't get a supply of timber. And everywhere I'm going, we're finding, for example, in the building supply chain, I'm working in this building industry in the UK, we're finding that the whole supply chain has been disrupted completely, and we have to rebuild it. One of the ways we to work together on ways of actually generating cash. There's been quite a lot of soft loans given by banks recently and governments. And I think what I would say to your clients, to your supply chain partners, look, at the moment, just at this point in time, what can we do to help each other? By maybe putting some money in the pot, me as well as you, me paying a little bit earlier, you accepting that there's a deal to be done on further payment terms thereafter, and see if you can make a change which is good to both parties. There's going to be a lot of that. And if this supply chain partner helped you in the bad times, try and help them now, because you'll find a solution together. There's always a solution. That's the way of capitalism. We'll find a solution. It's being open to that solution and accepting the boundary conditions of change, and say, look, I don't want to let this be a new condition for the future, but in this time of change, let's accept that we're going to do business to help each other in a very positive way. And that's the answer to that. I think that's the answer to your question.
Brilliant, thank you. We have another one here from Sartak. He's saying that people and companies will, of course, remember how they treat one another. Agreeing with that, how do you rationalize companies cutting employees? How do you handle that?
Well, companies are going to cut employees, probably by about 20%, I would think, in the near future. And of course, it'll be the least productive ones. Those people who've been either furloughed or on job retention schemes. Every company I'm working with now is looking at their output today and looking at the cost per unit output and thinking, I've learned something here. I can reduce my costs. And nobody's bringing back everybody that left. Nobody. And that's the way it is. And I think you just got to accept the fact that the changed times mean changed paradigms. Of course, business isn't going to come back in a wanna. Business is going to come back slowly in a sort of a ramped up version. And in those circumstances, you've got to cut your cloth. You've just got to do it sensitively as best you can. You've got to explain to people in a sensible manner. Don't treat them as less than a human being. Be kind to them in terms of the time you afford them, but be upfront and honest about it. Just say, look, things have changed. We can't bring everybody back, and I'm afraid you're not coming back. We haven't got a lot of cash, so don't imagine it's going to be a big cash payout because I can't do that. It's just about being honest and upfront with people and say, look, I'm sorry, this is the way it is, because you can't change it.
Thank you. Ayman is asking, how do you deal with landlords who are expecting to get paid fully or partially for the period during the pandemic?
Liar, liar, pants on fire is the answer to that. That's company policy, isn't it? Well, I'm afraid that isn't the way it is. Where's that money going to come from? Because that money's been lost forever. And if they say that's not my problem, yes, it is. They're part of the supply chain. They're a stakeholder in the same way that you are. You've given them a good living over the years. They're going to have to accept the fact that some things have just aren't possible. And in a circumstance where there's been a real glitch in revenue, and there's going to be another glitch over the next few periods, it's no longer possible to conform with the old paradigm. To say, look, guys, that's not going to happen. So let's think about how we're going to do. Maybe what we'll do is we'll extend the period of some people are extending the period of the rental and paying that at the end, but not paying it now. That sort of thing is happening today. And if they say, well, how am I going to pay the bank? Then you just ask the same question, well, how am I going to pay the bank? Come on, guys, you've got to get real. It's no good saying it's your problem, because it isn't. Negotiators try and mitigate the other people's concerns. They don't dump it on the other side. Anybody who tries to dump it on me, I say, look, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? And then you start talking.
Fantastic. Thank you, Malcolm. We have one more from Firas here asking, could you please tell me in 2 words how long approximately is it going to take for the world economy to recover?
I've got 2 perfect words for that. Don't know. Nobody knows the answer to that question. If they did, they'd be sitting on a beach in Barbados, just looking at their shares dramatically increasing in value. The short answer is longer than we would wish. And the more interesting answer is, but it will develop very quickly in some areas and less quickly in others. What does that mean? Some sectors are going to race ahead fairly quickly to try and catch up. For example, I'm involved with a company that actually negotiates power contracts for SME customers. We're doing a huge amount of business because those contracts are all coming up for renewal at the same time, and we just got to catch up. So we're doing very well. Other companies are supplying digital solutions to sales training for people at home. They're doing very well. But if you're in the building business, it isn't going to happen overnight, is it? If you're in the car business, I just wonder what's going to happen there. I haven't the faintest idea what's going to happen there. That's a really dangerous area to be in at the moment. And there's a lot of people suffering really badly in the car business. Not electric cars, which I think will do very well, but the old petrol diesel ones, there's a few issues there. So no one can answer that question. Anybody who says they can is either a fool or an idiot, or a liar, should I say, because it's going to be lumpy. That's for certain, sure. The markets, for example, I'm just looking at the markets now. I'll tell you what the Dow Jones is doing today. The Dow Jones is currently standing at, it's down 5.15 points, which is nothing at 25,000 points. 25,000 is a high for the Dow Jones. The FTSE is at 6,000. Now, the fact of the matter is those are high numbers. The FTSE was at 7,000 and a bit, but that's, that was a bit frothy. The Dow Jones at 25 is still pretty high point. So people are thinking that the markets are supposed to reflect the future. So in essence, they're supposed to be very efficient at forecasting the future. In essence, what they're saying is things aren't as bad as we think, and they're going to return to normal better and faster than we'd hope. But let's just put one little caveat here. All it needs is a resurgence in coronavirus, and bang, the markets have gone again, and bang, the future growth is going to be diminished, and it will be further out. No one really knows. We are really hostage to fortune. If we can get past coronavirus, well, one thing I will say, if we had a vaccine for coronavirus today, the markets would dramatically change over the next 12, 18 months. That's a fact. We would just race ahead, because this current glitch isn't because everything was going wrong. Well, it was slowing down a bit in the last quarter of 2019 to those people who follow these things. The reality is the market situation we're in now is a function of the virus. If we could take that problem out of the equation, we would dramatically expand our horizons in terms of economic output. But that isn't the case, so we don't know. If there's one more question, I'll answer it, then you can move on to your bit. I'm happy to do that if that's okay with you, William.
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely. I know that there are many questions, and I apologize if we can't go through all of them. I'm sure they're all very interesting questions, and I'm sure Malcolm would have been happy to answer all of them. But I'm just conscious of time, so thank you very much, everyone, for listening in, for tuning in. I'll just do that one last bit. In that case, Malcolm, if you don't mind moving to the next slide. And I hope you enjoyed the session. For those of you who are familiar with the University of Manchester Middle East Centre, we of course offer our global part-time MBA in the Middle East. So as you can see, we currently offer the global part-time MBA, which is a 24-month program, a two-year program. We also offer the Global Accelerated Program, which is an 18-month program. We have the Kelly Manchester Global MBA, which is a 24-month program as well. It's a joint degree program between the Kelly School of Business, which is part of Indiana University in the US, and the University of Manchester. So you do get 2 degree certificates at the end of the program. And we of course offer the full-time MBA, which is done in 12, 15 or 18 months in the UK only, not in the Middle East. So for more information in regards to this program, you can visit our website at manchester.ae. You can request a callback or download a brochure if you are interested in learning more about these programs. Our student counselors at the Middle East Centre would be happy to answer your questions and to help you in determining if this is the right program for you or not. So with that said, thank you very much for attending this session. We really do hope you've enjoyed Professor Malcolm Smith's webinar session on, of course, Beyond the Black Swan, a follow-up session, and we look forward to our next session with you, Malcolm. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you all. Thank you all for attending, and stay safe.
Absolutely. Stay safe and take care.